Thank you, Deborah and ACT, for allowing us to translate information together. Wasn't that what you said, Stuart? We need to translate between the scientists and the practitioners. So I would consider myself an engineer and I guess a practitioner of the City of Vancouver. And I was hired actually to mitigate climate change as part of the team, and our acting manager, Kairos, is in the background. She wasn't able to hear the morning session, but she's here to answer questions later if possible. But I'd like to spend 5 minutes to explain to you actually why we're actually working with Pete here to develop a list of variables and projections. A lot of what all of you have already seen is being presented in different ways. And that's because Council directed us 3 years ago to mitigate climate change, and we developed a complicated plan that became clear over time, and we're taking some actions in the community to mitigate. But 3 years into that planning, Council, and that's last year, directed us to all of a sudden, you need to also adapt to climate change. So there was a political will and also a will in our community last year to take action to adapt to climate change. And that allowed people like myself to come into the city as a staff member and actually consider ways that we could begin adaptive planning. We're not first at that. City of Toronto has done a lot of work. King County has done a lot of work already. But what we want to do is be one of the practitioners at a local level that's using science, that's translating the science into our community, and then beginning an adaptive planning process. So what we're doing, and the work that we're doing, is summarized in a council report that's publicly available. It's a little bit dry. It's not a publishable report, but it's available, and anyone who wants to get a hold of that can go on to a link next week. So we're presenting a summary of what I'm telling you to our City Council, and that's after they asked us last year to begin adaptive planning. So adaptive planning for us really meant that we needed to form a working group. So we have a working group led by myself and another member of our senior engineering team at the city who runs actually our waterworks and sewers, etc. So we have internal leadership. I'm in the sustainability group, and what we did, I guess, at the early stage was this network. We got out and networked and talked to people over the last several months about what's happening with the science, what are other jurisdictions doing. And what we realized, I guess, 3 key things, and that's what I wanted to share with you. Number one, the main challenges for a city are to obtain useful projections that can be applied locally. Right now, our engineers at the city and planners don't have enough confidence in the projections that are out there. There's enough uncertainty that in some ways their hands have been tied. So that's one issue. And then the second level, local governments, and this is a good news story, don't need to completely change their existing planning. So we don't need to change the way we're planning. We just need to embed some flexibility into our planning process to allow for the projections as they come in to evolve our own planning. So understanding the projections are not as good as they need to be yet necessarily in some key areas that I'll show you on this slide, but also understanding that they will get better over time. We wanted to have a process started at the city to start working through that. So that didn't mean that a person like myself will be issuing plans, rather that as we do our regular planning, as I mentioned to Dan, that we have a 3-year capital planning process, that we have people who are ready with the climate projections to be able to make slightly different decisions than they might make otherwise. We already have some good feeling that can happen now. And we do believe we need to do for the City of Vancouver an overall vulnerability assessment. Because we haven't actually done this kind of work before, we think it's important to do an overall vulnerability assessment. So we will be doing that this year. And we'll be doing it using data that we're getting coming from climate scientists. Some of you are around the room, including Katrina and Trevor and Aurelia and Stuart and others. And Jenny's from the BC government here to help us. So what we did was we developed within our working group a framework. So that framework is following the King County work. It's making sure you have the climate data available. And we felt we didn't actually have that data. Actually, a good example, the data that Katrina was presenting before was difficult for us to absorb. So we felt we needed, and this is from our engineers and planners at the city, we needed about 10 or 12 variables to focus in on that were important to our city planning. And for us, the most important first areas were in our sewers and stormwater, parks and roadways. And so for those areas, we wanted to consider the variables that are up there. We weren't actually sure how we were going to interpret the data that we have, but first and foremost, we just wanted it in a one table. It's quite interesting to tell you that now today, just by having a table, just by having one table, has been a success story for us at the city. You may think, what is he talking about, having a table? And how are you using that table? Well, we're not using it yet. The point is that a number of engineers, leading engineers and planners in the city know that there are projections that are out there, and we know that there's some weakness. For example, in wind, we don't have any data under projections that we can use at the city planning. Whereas in intense rain, as I was mentioning, on frequency of occurrence greater than 5 millimeters in 6 hours, we've got some regional climate model data that's helpful to us. And it substantiates work that I mentioned we already are doing in our integrated sewer management plan. So we're actually upgrading our sewers, and the work we're doing in our sewers is telling us that if we had projections in 2080s of 48% increase in frequency of occurrence of greater than 5 millimeters in 6 hours, that in fact we might have a 50% safety margin in our size of our sewers. So that's potentially a good news story, but we don't have confidence in all the data yet. The point is that our planners and engineers feel like there's potential now to have data available. And that, I think, is the beginning of the process that Stuart talked about translating data into a form that's useful for city planners. So as a next step, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the science that's there now in all these areas, and we're going to go in and do a vulnerability assessment later on this year. City of Richmond's doing a similar thing tomorrow. I don't know if Margot or who will be speaking. Is it Margot? It's Margot. So Margot will be talking about work done with Environment Canada and a scoping study. And what they've done is they've interviewed their city staff and said, where do you think you're vulnerable? Where are you resilient? Where are you vulnerable? And we're going to be doing that at the City of Vancouver over the course of this year too. We're doing an internal interview process, and we're doing a vulnerability assessment. And then over time, we hope that we can drill down to specific areas of concern to our city planning, and then broaden our adaptive planning too. In Ottawa, you're already looking at broader planning areas. We're not at that stage that we're looking at broadening right now. Our directive is to look at our infrastructure first, but because of this process that we're engaged in, there's now planners in the city that want to go farther to look at other areas that we might consider in the livability of our city, in land use planning, making different decisions, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to go into that decision making. So lastly, I would just want to tell you, actually Kiris knows this because she heard the message, that there's one of the senior city engineers, we mentioned to him about the process that we're following now, and he said that he had a high degree of confidence that it would take us on a new path in our city planning. And he said that what makes him lose sleep at night related to his city work is not about how we're mitigating climate change, because he knows that that's important and we're working on that already. But what makes him lose sleep at night is how resilient is our infrastructure to climate change. And I thought that was just striking, because it made me realize, why weren't we doing this first? And none of us have the answer to that, or maybe some of us think we do. But the good news is we're embarking on a process in the City of Vancouver. Thank you.